powers panel. And they have Karin Stögner. She is a professor for sociology in Passau. Passau is nearby Vienna. If people don't know the place where Passau is, it's nearby Vienna, but it's part of Bavaria. After being in very different places like Frankfurt am Main and in other universities, she came to Passau, and she is there a sociologist, an expert of critical theory. Not only in Sao Paulo they are doing critical theory, also in Passau, because in Passau too. But here is really a very strong base for critical theory. She's also expert in feminist theory, political sociology, and she wrote her last book is about, I will say it in German, Antisemitismus und Sexismus, historisch-gesellschaftliche Konstellation. Antisemitism and sexism, historical social constellations. It's in German.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to talk at this important conference for an important new institution. As Marianne already mentioned, my theoretical background is particularly in critical theory of the Frankfurt School, in combination with particular feminist theory. So what I'm actually trying to do is to try mediation between feminism and critical theory. And of course, intersectionality theory is a particular problem with that. And what I'm trying to do is to read intersectionality as applied dialectics. And of course, this needs to read intersectionality in a certain way, because normally intersectionality is not associated with dialectical theory, and this becomes evident particularly with the problem of identity and non-identity. So the immediate starting point of my considerations here is that problem of identity and of categorization in a society that is based on utter inequality. So the question is, how do we have to respond to this problem? And anti-racist and anti-sexist struggles face the challenge of how to deal with identity and of how to deal with social categorization. There are voices on the one hand that say that any political struggle needs a political subject that is necessarily connected with a collective identity, be it women, be it blacks, be it any other identity group. They ground their political action in what they call lived experience of oppression, suffering, and discrimination. Identity is then likely to be fixed along the social categories of sex, gender, and race, ethnicity, religion, whatever you want. In contrast, and in opposition to this, there are other voices saying that focusing on the suffering of political identities has led to a demise of a critique of the capitalist structures of our societies, and instead has invigorated a culturalist veil of recognition and dignity that hinders political change. Moreover, these political subjects are said to be the effect of power and exclusion and to lead to ever more exclusion. These voices advocate a radical negation of identity and instead promote non-identity. In both cases, I would say, identity and non-identity are viewed independent of each other and not in a dialectical tension with each other. Within intersectionality, there are different ways of dealing with the problem of categorization and of identification. Leslie McCall names basically three approaches. These are the intercategorical approach, the intra-categorical approach, and thirdly, the anti-categorical approach. I would like to go a little bit into these three approaches, and I would like to start with the first two approaches, with the inter and the intra-categorical approach, because they seem to promote identity politics. And then I will come to the anti-categorical approach, because this is the non-identity approach. And in between, I would like to position Adorno's critique of identity and the dialectics of non-identity and identity. So the intercategorical approach of intersectionality focuses on the functional interplay of race, gender, and class on the structural level of domination. The intra-categorical approach, in contrast, places the analytical emphasis on differences and contradictions within a social category, for example, women, and they view categories as heterogeneous. Both approaches, however, emphasize the importance of social categorization. While in the intercategorical approach, the categories race, class, gender, and so on are used for the time being as analytical instruments to describe complex social realities, complex social relationships, complex relations of domination. In the intra-categorical approach, they seem to describe a reality of life of groups. So to a different extent, both approaches remain caught in the social pressure of categorization and in the repressive logic of identification. Both approaches observe that society is organized along structuring categories such as race, ethnicity, class, gender, religion, and so on, and that these categories are actually entangled, so they cannot be viewed isolated from one another. But I would say that with this important, very important insight, the social constraint that is at work in the logic of identity and in the principle of categorization is not yet clear and is not yet criticized. Moreover, in the political practice of social movements that invoke intersectionality, the socially prescribed categories are likely to be adopted positively and affirmatively. That way, the repressive social categories are reclaimed and take on a positive connotation as identity criteria for the individuals, and the individuals no longer primarily recognize in these categories a constraint inflicted on them from society, but rather actively affirm them as moments of self-consciousness and empowerment in the political struggle for recognition. So if I do some criticism on this, I do not mean that we shall not see the categories anymore, that we shall not see the importance and the effect of the categories anymore, but rather that we shall not build identities on them. So I like actually Naomi Wolf's response to this problem. Let me quote, "There is nothing wrong with identifying one's victimization. The act is critical. There is a lot wrong with molding it into an identity." End of quote. This tendency, however, is part of an identity political constriction that has characterized intersectionality, especially since the turn of the millennium. The focus here is on the personal, is not on personal identities, but on collective identity of groups and communities. A new identity pressure is arising, and this is widely being criticized in current identity politics, and this pressure may have a leveling effect onto individual differences within collectivities and groups. Ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation is in particular, these categories are recognized as the cause of the multi-layered social exclusions and marginalizations. And these are differences that are connected with the unequal attribution of power. But these are at the same time differences that can also be revalued. For example, Black becomes a positive category of identity. Black is beautiful, Black is powerful. With this, however, the repressive social color line is negatively confirmed. Gender and sexuality can be transformed in a similar way in a different repetition of social performance and can be the source of resistance. Now, the question is whether it is indeed as easy as this. So whether racism and sexism can be overcome by affirming and appreciating the differences ascribed to bodies. To me, this seems to overemphasize the position of those being affected by stereotypes, by prejudice, by discrimination, and seems to leave aside those who are actually sexist, who are actually racist. And additionally, it leaves aside the racist and sexist structures of our societies. Already in the early years of intersectionality, debate, Donna Haraway called for intersectional approaches to differentiate between differences when she laconically stated, let me quote, "Some differences are playful, some are poles of world historical systems of domination. Epistemology is about knowing the difference," end of quote. So following this criticism, it must be emphasized that race and gender are not simply differences that should be recognized, appreciated, and valued in identity constructions, but actually that they are poles of world historical systems of domination that need to be overcome. Political action against domination shall lead to equality as well as to the dignity of difference. Because if we leave out equality, then the dignity of difference leaves power relations unchanged and untouched. It is precisely in judging and assessing identity that major differences between intersectionality and critical theory occur. Identity politics is widely regarded in today's prevailing directions of intersectionality as a suitable strategy for strengthening marginalized particularities against the repressive tyranny of the universal, to quote Angela Davis. For critical theory, it seems to be the other way round. Identity is viewed as a manifestation of historical and social processes of reification and alienation. Thus, it is rather a sign of the triumph of the false universal over the particular. To quote Adorno, identity thinking says what something falls under, of which it is a copy or representative, meaning what it is not itself, end of quote. From this perspective, the identity political contraction of intersectionality strengthens the principle that underlies instrumental reason, the binary logic that constantly produces the non-identical as its other. So here the critique of identity unfolded by Horkheimer and Adorno, particularly in the Dialectic of Enlightenment and then later in Negative Dialectics. This critique refers to the all-encompassing mastery of nature that has a deep impact to all human relationships. Identity is the cornerstone of this civilization. It orders, categorizes, and unifies a world that is marked by diversity and multiplicity. It unifies and orders nature. Through the process of abstraction, the whole world is narrowed down to the formula that eventually contains only the 0 and the 1. This is the basic binarity for which gender binarity serves as a social model. Identity thinking reduces the manifold to the identical one. The principle that persists thereby, that remains the one, this principle is the subject itself. Through the concepts, the subject imposes identity on what the subject is not itself. Therefore, the principle of identity, like actually every principle, is a principle of thinking, and that does not lie immediately in the object itself. It presupposes the identity of thinking and being. But what Horkheimer and Adorno also show, however, is that identity fails and dissolves precisely because it categorically excludes the non-identical and denies the manifold and denies nature within and without, be it corporeality, be it emotionality, be it pain, be it anxiety. As a result, the identical self becomes identical with which it is not, which is not itself. Under the condition of late capitalism, it vanishes in conformism, outward orientation, unreflected functioning, subsumption under existing categories, and adaptation to ruling powers. To quote again Adorno, identity becomes the authority for a doctrine of adjustment, in which the object repays the subject for what the subject has done to it. So finally, the subject itself becomes purely abstract and unidentical. So paradoxically, non-identity triumphs over identity in advanced modernity, just as nature, if only mastered, revolts against civilization and eventually triumphs in barbarism. Perennial domination shows its effect also in the uncomprehended dialectics of identity and non-identity. This is a major point of criticism in dialectics of enlightenment and negative dialectics. An immediate emphasis on identity in identity political intersectionality, where categories are positively re-evaluated, albeit their repressive context of domination. This emphasis is being criticized massively by queer theory. Queer theory which demands that intersectionality and identity be radically separated from one another. Roderick Ferguson's Queer of Color critique, for example, explicitly includes intersectionality as a non-identical approach. Therefore, instead of emphasizing marginalized or invisible identities of groups and collectives, a queer critique refuses to identify with those categorical attributions that originate from and reproduce domination. To quote Ferguson, "To assume that categories conform to reality is to think with instead of against hegemony," end of quote. In contrast to inter- and intra-categorical approaches, which tend to make social differences the basis of identities, an anti-categorical approach not only refuses to utilize categories such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality as the basis for identity formation, but much more radically and much more fundamentally, it refuses to recognize identity as a normative framework at all. It is precisely this social authority that is to be unconditionally deconstructed by emphasizing the non-coherence, non-identity of intersectionally perceived, conceived processes of subjectivation. This is a radical objection to any identity politics and, moreover, a manifestation of a radical individualism. Others call this indeterminacy and a fetishization of the non-identical. And indeed, if non-identity is unconditionally brought to the fore, the deconstruction of identity threatens to overshoot the mark and achieve the opposite of what it intended. It becomes ever more difficult to formulate a political subject, be it women, be it blacks, whatever group. Because such a unifying concept would do harm to the individual particularities, this to non-identitarian moments within the category. In this regard, Nancy Fraser criticized already in 1993, let me quote, that the current proliferation of interchangeable, commodity-shaped images and significations that shall counter the reification of identity is as great a threat to women's liberation as fixed normative identities. In fact, processes of de-reification and processes of reification are two sides of the same post-Fordist coin, end of quote. And indeed, from Adorno's radical critique of identity and from his turn to the non-identical, it cannot be concluded that the non-identical is the particular to be advocated unconditionally, which would actually exist out there, and which, under the rule of the false universal, would have no space but that of the unnamed. Non-identity is not per se liberating, nor is it simply the antithesis of reified fixed identity. Rather, identity and non-identity are dialectically bound together and thus cannot be separated. Queer anti-identity politics, however, sometimes gives the impression that if only the non-identical was strengthened and made autonomous in relation to the identical, repressive pitfalls of the logic of identity could be overcome. In doing so, it overlooks that in fact successful identity itself is the contradictory unity of identity and non-identity. It is the tension. If this tension is resolved on one side by idolizing non-identity and rejecting identity, the non-identical threatens to be subsumed under the very constraints of identity that is actually under critique. In this way, queer refusal of identity and the dissolution of the subject in shifting pluralities paradoxically tip over into the affirmation of limited identity. And these limited identities are organized in the form of commodities in ever smaller pieces, so that in the end, the differences become indifferent again. And the critique is that neoliberal economy needs exactly these flexible subjects in order to function. While the criticized intersectional identity politics sometimes turns the individual into a mere appendage of collective identities, on the one hand, on the other hand, we see in the queer unease with identity that the individual tends to be abruptly and without mediation being placed in the center of the analysis and in the center of reflection. And the question of the dialectics between individual and society is blinded out in both ways. In contrast to this, I would say that a rescuing critique of identity is needed, a rescuing critique as proposed by critical theory, which would recognize identity as a tension between identity and non-identity. It would furthermore reformulate identity in such a way that it gains substance and succeeds precisely in reflecting on and in including the non-identical. Thereby, the non-identical does not coincide with being different. The non-identical rather is the moment of differentiation of an identity, of a subject identical with itself. So it is indeed the mediation of identity and non-identity that makes identity work at all. From this perspective, identity is successful only if it is mindful of the non-identical. Criticism of difference and identity should therefore not so much be directed against the identical subject, which can only be identical by remembering the non-identical. Criticism should rather be directed against repressive identification in the sense of conceptual classification systems as a means of stabilizing reified and alienated social conditions, against stereotypical thinking. Identity politics may well level plurality and diversity, or it may advocate groups that want to make their particularity generally binding. And of course, criticism of these tendencies is absolutely necessary, is absolutely needed. But critical thinking on difference should not per se close itself off to all those group identities to which political struggles refer, and which always also adopt categorizations made by society. We cannot jump out of these constraints of categorization. These categorizations negatively express a common interest and a shared problem. Thus, solidarity can have a particular starting point in group identities and yet point beyond restricted particularity. As Regina Pecker-Schmidt put it, solidarity can be a regulative idea that produces communities in historical processes in which their members, freed from gender, class-specific and socio-cultural discrimination, regulate their social concerns in mutual agreement with each other. End of quote. Both difference and identity can thus be repressive, but on the other hand, depending on the constellation and on the way they are conceptualized, they can also have an emancipatory effect. And this is what critical theory reflects on. It reflects on the extent to which emancipation and freedom can tip over into their opposite. It examines how identity can tip over into non-identity, how the universals carry their own negation historically within themselves as hegemonic particularities. Yet it strives for a rescuing critique of universalism. It does not just do away with universalism. It sticks to a particular understanding of universalism as a non-hegemonic particularity. It is no longer merely a universalism that no longer merely comprises a hegemonic particularity that excludes others. But rather, I think this form of universalism has to be considered as a framework for unfolding an experience of the particular. This universal normative framework was described by Adorno, much quoted, as the better state in which one can be different without fear. Intersectionality should therefore keep in mind in everything it does for the urgently needed recognition and strengthening of marginalized and exploited particularities that concern for the particular is not to be confused with particularism. The particular is not by itself good. The same counts for the non-identical. Rather, it is part of the constellation with the universal in which both are equally damaged. Where intra, and anti-categorical intersectionality necessarily fails because of the social contradiction of equality and difference, contradiction between identity and non-identity. In contrast to this, I think dialectical intersectionality draws analytical sharpness exactly from these contradictions. This is so because it does not attempt to resolve these contradictions on one side, but it recognizes as a real contradiction. And these real contradictions cannot be simply eliminated, neither conceptually nor practically. I thank you very much for your attention and for your patience.